First of all, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good morning, everyone. And we would like to welcome all our speaker and all our audience for the actually coming. I know it is Friday, Saturday is a weekend, but that means that you are really enthusiastic actually for the resuscitation and for the improvement of or saving life in country. So we would like just to announce that we are going to have a closing ceremony tomorrow after October break. So we need your attendance for that one actually, and we are going to have also during that time an appreciation for some instructors, those who have been participating in a project and initiatives of Makkah Safe City. Makkah is a safe hub city, and that's just because it is not included in your program, so that's just I want to announce it for that. I would like to present, we'll start our session, and I would like to present our guest speaker. The first speaker, Professor Carl Kerr. Professor Carr is a professor of medicine, and he is a co-director of the UAE Cerebral Heart Center, and he is a chair of the Cerebral Heart Center Resuscitation Research Group. And also Professor Carl, actually, we have been met several times in ELCO meeting, and really he gave me a pleasure accepting our invitation to come for our resuscitation. Professor Carl, he is also the chapter of ACC in the American Heart Association. I would like to welcome Professor Carl.
Thank you. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. This is my first travels to the Middle East, and particularly to Saudi Arabia. I'm delighted to have this opportunity. I have several financial disclosures. I am a consultant to both Physiocontrol and Zoll Medical. I have grants from a number of institutions as listed. Well, I'd like to start by simply asking, what is the purpose of CPR? It's simple. It is to move blood around the circulation when the heart is not pumping. Secondarily, it is to maintain and replenish the oxygen supply through ventilation. Recent guidelines have emphasized that compressions are probably more important early on than ventilations, particularly for adults. I realize there's some pediatricians with us today, and clearly that may be different. For most, cardiac arrest in children is secondary to a respiratory problem first. Well, how does CPR move blood? It moves blood by chest compressions. And I'd like to just kind of take you through how that works. First, understand that even at its best, chest compressions are not that effective. They produce about 20 to 40% of normal blood flow to the brain, but only about 10 to 20% of normal blood flow to the heart. And though these amounts are not normal, they are enough to at least preserve viability of those two organs, the heart and the brain. Those organs are perfused by perfusion pressure gradients generated across the brain or across the heart, what's called cerebral perfusion pressure or coronary artery perfusion pressure. This is a schematic of how the myocardium is perfused during CPR. During the relaxation phase of chest compressions, coming off the chest, the pressure in the aorta is pushing blood down the coronary artery, that LAD, if you will. But at the same time, the pressure generated in the right atrium impedes flow. So it's the difference between the aortic diastolic pressure and the aortic diastolic or relaxation pressure. Anything that disrupts that generation of perfusion pressure gradient will decrease blood flow to the heart. The most prominent is interruptions secondary to ventilation. Here's what happens schematically. This is actually a pressure tracing of an experimental model where the green lines are right atrial pressure, with the peak obviously on the top of the screen, the diastolic pressure down here at the lower end. And the yellow is the aortic pressure. So in the beginning here on the left side, you see that there's very little pressure gradient between those two. But over time of these 15 compressions, the aortic diastolic pressure increases while the right atrial diastolic pressure remains constant. That difference is what generates the perfusion to the myocardium. But look what happens when you stop pressing. When compressions are interrupted, those pressures return to almost zero, and you must regenerate that perfusion gradient. So anything that gets in the way of compressions has an ill effect on perfusing the heart with oxygen and blood. That can result in a heart that then no longer responds to defibrillation. Well, this is a bumper sticker for a car that I found a few years ago from the American Heart Association. I believe it's true. CPR does save lives, but we've always wondered if it couldn't save more. In 2003, the leadership of Tucson Fire, our paramedic-based fire system, came to us and said, we need to do something different. They had for 20 years followed the American Heart Guidelines, but had kept very careful record of outcomes in the city of Tucson. And as you can see, whether for all rhythms or for just ventricular fibrillation, those survival rates varied a little, but frankly were not improving. And overall, we had a 6% for all rhythms and only a 10% survival for ventricular fibrillation. And so they just came to us and said, let's do something else. About that time, we had been working in the laboratory on a simplified technique called chest compression only. In the beginning, it was simple. We knew that early CPR can save lives. Early CPR usually means bystander or public produced CPR, and yet the public or the bystanders, at least in the US, were becoming more and more unwilling to do CPR. When we asked them why, there were a number of reasons. They weren't trained, it was hard, but the most dramatic was they were afraid of contracting disease. They didn't want to do the mouth-to-mouth breathing. It wasn't just the public, but Joe Renato and John Brenner had both shown that doctors, nurses, and even CPR instructors were likewise reluctant to do mouth-to-mouth. When we asked 1,000 people in Arizona, this is what we found. If we asked them simply, would you be willing to do mouth-to-mouth rescue breathing and compressions on a stranger? Only 15 said yes. Then we said, well, what if you've been taught that compression only was just as effective? Would you be willing to do that? And you can see that 70% were willing to do that. And so, since we believe that compression was really the origin of blood flow during cardiac arrest, we moved very quickly to a scheme where we eliminated the mouth-to-mouth breathing. First, we did this in experimental models. This is an animal model, and not just a few, but 170. What we found was when we did standard CPR versus compression only, the red bar, versus no BLS, and simply waited for 8 to 10 minutes until advanced life support arrived, we saw no difference in outcome between if we ventilated or not, but a huge drop-off if we did nothing. And that's what was happening. The lay people of Tucson, Arizona were making the phone call for help, 911, but were not starting any kind of CPR themselves. Well, the next thing we did, we got involved with Douglas Chamberlain over in Great Britain. We did an experiment in Cardiff, Wales, where we trained about 500 Welsh. Half we trained in standard CPR, chest compressions and ventilation, mouth to mouth, and half we trained in just compression only. The most astounding thing we found was that when we videotaped these individuals performing what they had been taught, those taught standard CPR took 15 to 16 seconds to deliver the 2 breaths. Now, I actually had been part of the writing group in 2000, just before this experiment, that wrote that you should give 2 breaths, 2 seconds per breath, or 4 seconds. And we simply assumed that was possible. When we got actually to testing whether people could do that, we were astounded they could not. It takes them much longer. And so, again, we see that when they would stop, the perfusion pressure would go down to 0. Here's another way of looking at that. The top group is ideal CPR, where it's indeed just 4 seconds between compressions for the 2 breaths. But in reality, for lay persons, the public, the 16-second pause looks more like this. And if you look at this bottom trace, you can see there's really only blood flow generated for 40% of the time. 60%, there's no real perfusion either to the head or the heart. Well, what if you eliminate the mouth-to-mouth ventilation in CPR? What happens? Well, for the adult witnessed arrest in ventricular fibrillation, there is oxygen already in the lung, in the arterial bed, and the real issue is when they arrest, they collapse and there's no circulation of that oxygen. The real challenge is to simply move it to the tissues that need it, to the brain and the heart. This is also an animal project, but I think shows what is also true in people, and that is the desaturation curve that occurs during compression-only CPR during ventricular fibrillation. Notice it takes quite a while for the oxygen level within the body to drop down. In fact, even here at 10 minutes, it's still about 70%. Not normal, but enough to make a difference to keep tissue alive, particularly important tissue like brain tissue or heart tissue. However, again, for children, for example, or adults who drown or who asphyxiate, it's a different physiology. The red dotted line is that of an intact circulation that, for example, with a blocked airway where no more oxygen can be absorbed or no ventilation occurs. And notice how quickly then, while the circulation has yet not collapsed, the desaturation occurs. By 2 minutes, you're at 50%. Clearly, this group, the red line, needs ventilation. But the vast majority of out-of-hospital adult witness collapse is not the red line. It's the black line, where chest compressions alone are enough. Another important aspect of why rescue breathing is not necessary for VF is gasping. About 40 to 50% of adults who collapse suddenly will gasp and thereby actually ventilate during the first few minutes. If you start CPR, even just compression only, during that gasping time, they will continue to gasp, frankly, for minutes, 5, 6, even 7 minutes. Well, the real question is, can chest compressions only actually save lives? Again, back to our animal model, our laboratory work that we did in the early 2000s, in an era when the recommended standard CPR was 2 breaths followed by 15 compressions, recycled, 2 breaths, 15 compressions, and so on, versus compression only or continuous chest compressions. we found a dramatic difference. Not just was it as good, it was much better when we introduced the realistic pause of 16 seconds to deliver those 2 breaths. About that time, the standard guidelines changed to be 30 to 2, or 30 compressions and 2 breaths. So we repeated that work, and it was somewhat better. But it still was not as good as compression-only CPR. Well, that's animal work. What about people? This has been done in people. This is the first kind of case report that I'm aware of. When the early days in Seattle of dispatcher-directed CPR on the 911 system, this was the recording that they shared with me. An individual, a spouse of a collapsed man, called in and was instructed to push on his chest by the operator. And this is what she said: "Why is it every time I press on his chest, he opens his eyes? And every time I stop to breathe for him, he goes back to sleep?" Truly, she understood what we've been trying to show ourselves, that circulation is what counts, not strictly ventilation in the early minutes. This was the first report in 2000 of dispatcher-assisted CPR training, teaching either chest compression only or standard CPR, and a 50% increase, although small numbers, with the simplified way. These are follow-up studies. This one from Scandinavia, lots more patients. This one from Seattle in the 2010 era. And here's all 3 of those reports added together. And when you add these and simply do a chi-square comparison with the power that these 3 studies combined show, there is a significant benefit for teaching compression only by the dispatcher for improving survival. Well, we then took the next step in Tucson and began to teach our community. The first thing we did in 2003 was have a kickoff where we invited all the newspapers. We began then an aggressive training campaign. Every month we have a free class for the public to come learn compression-only CPR. We put up billboards on the streets. We put up little placards at the bus stops. And then we sent this little placard in their electric bill, which is 600,000 homes. Simply talking about call 911, get help, put the victim on the floor and push on his chest at 100 times a minute. We expanded that to the whole state of Arizona in 2005. We often teach classes at public events. This is the Phoenix Suns basketball arena. This is the University of Arizona basketball. This was kind of a fun project. Every once in a while, these 3-point cards are placed on every seat. And when our team scores a 3-point, the audience holds the card up, just like that.
Dr. Abdulhamid Khan, the president of Pan Arabic Station and the chairman of the Saudi National CPR Committee. He will address to us the update. You know, Saudi Arabia now is leading the race. Saudi Arabia now is, is leading the area. So thank you very much for inviting us to this meeting, and let us listen what you have, you, our friend.
Thank you very much, Ari. Actually, it's more than what they're supposed to be. Okay.
All right, so let us go for the presentation. It is written updates in 2017, and I have been lucky enough to attend the High meeting this month for the ILCOR meeting, actually, and at the same time we had a publication from ILCOR at CIVIC this month for new PICO updates or PICO position updates. So you are lucky actually to hear that recent, I mean, as as a new, fresh information. Okay. So updates of guidelines or updates of, let's say, recommendation in CPR is being organized and is being more materialized and more systematized than before, particularly has been started from 2000 when the court started to look to the matter from a systemic way and doing reviews, reviewing the articles, reviewing the RCTs, and making the updates or making the recommendation and updating the science of cardiovascular resuscitation. So ICOR is the International Liaison Commission for Resuscitation or Resuscitation, and it is consisting of 7 organizations, AHA, ARC, South African, Australia and New Zealand, the Foundation of Heart in Canada, the Inter-American, and the Asian. So there are 7, and luckily enough that we had also the observer status as a Pan-Arab Resuscitation Council in ICOR. So as I told you, November 17, there was a new publication in circulation for the 2017 update. And just to remind you, ICOR, they are making recommendation. They are the one setting the question. They are reviewing the question, evaluating the evidence, formulating the for our formulation of that evidence by the board, or what we call it, the review board, and then they are making their treatment or writing their treatment recommendation. And then it comes our rule as councils that we put the guidelines according to our culture, according to our nature, according to the status of the country, okay? And in the same time, what is best for the implementation of these guidelines. So this is a sensitive, it is, if you can see the slide, it's a bit complicated slide, but this is how people, they are working as task groups actually in ICOR. A lot of task groups, these task groups, they are looking for an evidence and looking for the best evidence of resuscitation sign. This is the same how the things is going actually there from the science or advisory and the information specialist until the recommendation and the co-star is being written, and then it's being published. One of the statements which is being written in 2015 guidelines by ICOR in their publication, that individual councils write their guidelines, okay? And that's why, because a specific recommendation varies between region, local drug or device availability, okay, and different interpretation of data, and the decision about topics with insufficient evidence to a recommendation or to against that recommendation. So this is being published in 2015, and we can just see that ICOR member organization will subsequently publish resuscitation guidelines that are consistent with the science in this consensus publication. But they will also take into account geographic, economic, and system difference in practice and availability of medical device and drug, and the ease of or difficulty of training. All ICOR member organizations are committed to minimize international differences. Yes, there is differences, but it is very minimal. It doesn't even reach 10% difference between all organizations, okay? To optimize the effectiveness of resuscitation practice, instructional method, teaching aids, and training goals, okay? So these are the things which really affect your training, your outcome, even in resuscitation. The new and revised treatment recommendation, any new or revised treatment recommendation doesn't mean that the previous one, which is not even mentioned, that it is unsafe or
So the newest development in the resuscitation science, 2010, noted the improvement of the outcome after the out-of-hospital witness shockable ventricular fibrillation. This is one of the facts. When you start early CPR, like Prof. Kerr said, so early CPR, it means that you will have very good outcome and you can save life. So let us just go ahead of what is being published in 2017 and compare it to 2015 guidelines. So the first one was a compression to ventilation ratio, dispatch assisted adult. It's been mentioned by Professor Carr, actually. Okay, and the Replenish recommendation that in 2015 that the dispatcher provide chest compression only, that give an instruction of chest compression only. We had almost the same, the Saudi Arab recommendation. When we adopt that recommendation, okay, we are highly recommend a specific tailored education program for the dispatcher. Unfortunately, if you look to our dispatcher system here, we are just, they are receiving the whole location and that's it. And even now they are, when you call them by the telephone, they know your location immediately with the program safety. Okay, so they know their location come to you, but they didn't give you any instruction how to do. And please just correct me if I'm wrong, for anyone who has an idea of the improvement of the situation. In 2017, there is no change in the recommendation, in spite that there is no RCTs inconsistent with this, but for the sake of quick telephone and small doses of instruction, that's why we emphasize on the dispatcher that just give an instruction of chest compression. That's it. It's a small dose of instruction, and the people they can grasp it, and the people they can implement it, and they can do it. So chest compression, the second one, chest compression only versus conventional CPR in bystander adult. Okay, that's in the pre-hospital setting. 2015 recommendation, chest compression should be performed for all patients in cardiac arrest, and that was a strong recommendation, very low quality of evidence. But even though there was a suggestion that who are trained, those bystander or layperson, they are trained in CPR and they are trained to do ventilation, they can try to do chest compression with ventilation. So cycle of 30 to 2. We had the same recommendation for the pre-hospital that you can start chest compression, which is a cap for the pre-hospital, but we are recommending the practice of ABCs, airway, breathing and circulation inside the hospital. So in 2017 recommendation, it is almost the same, that however even the task force and acknowledge the potential additional benefit of conventional CPR when delivered by trained layperson. Okay, so if you don't know, do chest compression, please. The third one, which is being discussed as a bigger question also in the last publication, the chest compression only versus conventional CPR in a bystander pediatric, has been also highlighted by Professor Carr, actually, that the pediatric group, they do have their arrest secondary to the respiration or respiratory problems. So the recommendation in 2015 by the pediatric group that rescuer provide rescue breathe and chest compression. So they are still keeping the compression ventilation ratio for the children and infant in a pre-hospital. But that was a strong recommendation with very low quality. But still, if you don't even train to do the ventilation, do chest compression. At least you just provide the chest compression. 2017 recommendation, it was a strong recommendation in 2015 with the number of reviews of the RCTs and the number of, the recommendation of the big groups and the writing groups, they decrease the level or they decrease the strength of the recommendation to a weak recommendation with very low quality of evidence. So Discussing these updates, the other actually topics which is not mentioned, it doesn't mean that is being cancelled. No, it is still going on, and there is still a lot of working group. They are working other bigger questions. The aim that they have reviewing the evidence every now and then, and in every year, the commitment of report that they will have, and every year a review of questions that is going to be published, and reviewing the level of evidence for the resuscitation in the science of CPR. So in BLS, actually this is just what we call it, and the process of adaptation of the guidelines. Okay, so as an customer, that there is a process of adaptation of this recommendation by the councils in the region, by the councils at the national level. And that process of adaptation is an evidence-based adaptation, and we call it at the end, after we put the guidelines, we call them evidence-based guidelines according to the adaptation process that is being used on a scientific base. Chest compression, ventilation ratio adult, okay, that's the last in the review group which is being published. It is almost the same ratio, there is no change to 30 compression to ventilation. There is one new strong recommendation coming, that for the intubated patient, when you are doing a CPR for intubated patient, there is no pause of chest compression. So there is no coordination between the chest compression and breathing. Breathing should be given 8 to 10 per minute, and the chest compression should be continuously. So that actually also one of the recommendation. It is a weak recommendation, but it is still supporting what we are practicing. Educational, this is an issue actually we have been published it, and we have been that in the portal of CPR regarding the education and the implementation of the guidelines, and educating the people for the BLS and for the ACLS. I think most of the centers, at least centers, they receive a memo from the Saudi Heart Association that we are going to change the model of BLS training. We already have the e-learning model, which is working since the mid of 2017, and only the center they will just assist the candidate for the practical station. So there will be a pre-practice evaluation and teaching of the people on the mannequins, and then post-practice evaluation. And we had a workshop. We are going to make that workshop during the break time near the coffee break there for the coordinator, how the things is going to be done. Because we are going to change even the model of entering the result inside the system, so you will be aware of these changes. The same for the ACLS also. Okay, we are using the debriefing model, and we are going to show you how we are going to work with that model in hospital and in the training center. We need to have, like Professor Carl said, that we need to have a huge campaign actually for public, for the heart saver, layperson and bystander. And alhamdulillah, we already had some initiatives in that issue. We had Makkah Safe City, Makkah Heart Safe City as an initiative which has been started almost 6 months ago. We trained so far 5,000 heart saver, and we still, the project is in continuous. and that to serve started with Mecca, and I'm sure that is going to be initiated in other cities. Saudi Heart Association CPR guidelines 2017. What is the difference between 15 and 2010? So we have a continuous evidence evaluation and update of the guidelines according to the emergence of an evidence. That's a commitment of Al-Khor, and also that's a commitment of Saudi Heart, that we are going to update you in an annual basis, either through activities like this one or through the portal, so you can look and check for any update in the portal. You have been receiving an evidence-based guidelines 2017, and if you go for the update, this has been updated last month, September 2017. The new update, which is in November, is not included there, but I'm sure, inshallah, that is going to be posted in the portal soon, and you can look to that one as a reference for the guidelines. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for elaborating this new. My first question to you, what is your experience of trainings through electronic training or because in my country you found a lot of difficulty in such online program and e-learning. So what is your experience in Saudi Arabia?
Regarding the school training, regarding the school training, we can say we already started since long time. I can say since 2005 we started for the school training, but it was almost scattered activity rather than to be a systematized activity. But with the project of Mecca Heart Safe City, the education administration, actually they are more enthusiasm for the school training. We trained, during this project, we trained approximately 500 candidates from the school, including teachers and including students. I'm sure that also there is a speaker with us, Dr. Abdullah. Dr. Abdullah also arranging with the Saudi Heart Association a meeting with the Education Ministry, that we are going to make a project. This is actually, it's still under, under cover. There is a project of introducing CPR from elementary, intermediate and high school with a program, escalating program, according to the information for each level, and it aimed by a certification, an evaluation and certification, and even is going to be for male, probably for female, because now driving is coming even for female. Okay, so that we will have female drivers. Okay, so it will be aimed by a driving license also, that it will be required to have the certification. So this is a project, it's still under cover with a discussion with the higher authority.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much. In our basic CPR training courses, we all learn it.
Kindly, can you introduce yourself first?
Dr. Talib Hussein.
From where?
From the Meridien Jeddah Hospital. In our basic CPR training courses, we all learn to put our victim in the safest and most suitable position and conditions to perform the near to optimal CPR, and to keep performing this till the arrival of help, or the victim regain life, or the rescuer feel about to die. My first question is, what about performance in disabling and unavoidable conditions? For example, in a moving ambulance where the health practitioner is hardly keeping his balance and feel about to fall down. My second question is, what about the arrest event happening in an isolated spot where no help is expected, nor communication is available? For example, in a desert. I mean, when we are a group there, and we can have more than one rescuer alternating, when to stop, or shall we go on doing CPR forever? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tariq. Regarding your first question, I think that we can just postpone it for tomorrow. There is a lecture tomorrow by Professor Lim regarding mechanical ventilation. Okay, and he's going to highlight, I'm sure that he's going to highlight an issue about this one. Just simply that where it is impossible to do a chest compression or compression chest compression, there is an assistant, we can say, a way that can help in resuming or doing chest compression without the interference of the lay person or the bystander. Okay, so if you can, if you just postpone that question for tomorrow. Okay. The second question regarding when to stop CPR. Okay, should we continue forever, or you are the first responder? This is the rule. The first responder is the team leader. So the team leader is the one who's going to decide when to stop. Okay. You cannot make the CPR forever. You might do it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and you will be exhausted, okay, as a rescuer. So it depends on the situation, depends on the condition. We cannot make it generalized. It is an individualized condition, okay? So this depends on the rescuer himself, and he's the one who's going to decide when to stop CPR. Okay, I get exhausted, no help. I know that there is no way of coming or help coming, like in desert, for example. Okay, from maybe from the first few minutes, from the first 5 minutes, I didn't get any response. I didn't get any let's say hope. Okay, then I can't stop the CPR. Yes.
Sorry, my question is, we are a group, so we can alternate with each other. We are not one rescuer. We are 5 or 6.
So even okay.
So when to stop?
Even you are 5, that means that you have a team leader.
Yes.
Isn't it? So the team leader is the one who's going to decide.
Provided I'm a lead, I am the leader.
Perhaps you are the one who's going to decide when to stop.
But I can share you on some of our experience, because in my country we have similarities. Regarding your first question, we started to implant some of the mechanical compressors in the ambulance, but I cannot draw conclusion because it is early experience. Regarding the desert, because we start the program in the desert, why we have a problem of communication and we have problem of satellite or connecting to the ambulance. So we train people there and we start to find a lot of improvement. The third point which we face, due to medical legal and due to tradition in my country, you cannot announce death on the spot. So usually we tell them, work until, even if the patient, you notice that he is died, work until you transfer him to medical facility where they can announce this. Because nowadays we have a lot of problems when we said because to the extent they can fight and struggle with the medical profession. So usually in the streets and in the desert, we don't announce this. This is our experience in Malaysia. So any other experience from Jordan, for example, from mobile doctor? Because here we are sharing our experience to learn from each other. If you allow us to share our knowledge, because we are not advanced like you state.
I asked Professor Kern the same, and I think he should answer this.
His answer?
He should answer. The issue for the situation when you cannot expect that you will get out. No defect, and how long we should continue.
So these, putting in your mind our local circumstances and our political impact.
Sure. But even in Arizona, we have many remote areas. So for example, if you are hiking to the bottom of the Grand Canyon and you suffer a cardiac arrest, you're in big trouble, because help will not come for several hours, even if they helicopter down. So I think you have to be realistic. I think that, you know, a good rule of thumb is to do your best, and somewhere around 15 to 30 minutes, if you've not succeeded, they're still in cardiac arrest and no additional help is coming, I think it's very legitimate to stop. I would certainly feel better if it was me that I tried. For example, if I'm hiking in the Grand Canyon, it's going to be with friends. It's not typically a stranger. If it was my father with me, I would want to know that I made my best effort, and yet it was futile and I finally had to stop. But I think there's some benefit for having attempted, for the rescuer to feel like they have done what they could, even when it's almost certainly not going to be successful. But I think if it's time that you're looking for, 15 to 30 minutes, 30 if you have multiple rescuers, 15 if you're by yourself. If no additional help is coming, then I think it's legitimate to stop.
Abhijit, now if you have 3 millions coming at a small area in a fixed time, most of them are elderly with many cardiovascular risk factors. Many of them they had heart attacks before 90 years. About what do you do during the 3 millions coming? Even if one is at rest, it is impossible to reach you.
I can tell you that during Hajj, this is totally different story. Okay, during pilgrimage period and season, Hajj time, we are all in emergency plan. Okay, all the country in emergency plan. That means that all sectors in the country, they are working 24 hours, okay, in Makkah region. So there is no stop of the care, the health care during that season. And I can tell you that even we have a very good published data of very good outcome of people. Even those who are ill, those who are ischemic heart disease, they do have the time of, the time of the attack to transport to the best cardiac center within, I can tell you, within 15 minutes to 30 minutes, okay? So during Hajj time, it is not, I can tell you, it's not an,
it's not a regular feeling.
Not, yes.
Because sometimes it is impossible to reach it.
Sure. Okay. This is different story.
So going back to the, I mean, I can't agree anymore. But with the, you have to use when to stop. This is a very difficult question, but with yet more difficult answer to it. I think you have to use your logic. We have the same problem. I mean, you are a doctor, you are a leader, but the best thing, which Dr. Tariq mentioned, same thing applying in our area in Jordan, not to pronounce death in your own, in that area, wherever you are, leave the situation to arrive to a hospital where the facility or the bigger facility to inform the family when you can pronounce death. But when to stop, I mean, this is a very difficult question with more difficult answer. But at the end of the day, you are the doctor, you are the leader, you know, you got your instinct, you got your knowledge, when to stop, even when to start. Whether to start in already dead patient or to start in a viable patient, the same instinct when to start should come in when to stop.
You know, I can add something now. Due to aggressive attitude in people in Cairo and in Egypt all over, so they can attack the physicians, they can attack the medical profession. So what is the situation nowadays? Even if you arrive with a dead person, start working with him just only to protect yourself and transfer him to the nearest medical facility where you can announce this. This is the real situation we faced. So there is no guidelines, there is no consensus. It depends upon your local circumstance in your area. If your area is safe, do it. If it is not safe, play twice. This is my recommendation.
Right. My name is Dr. Untitled Chapter. I'm an internist from King Saud Medical City in Riyadh. I want to thank Dr. Abdul-Majid for his very nice overview. And I'm very happy that finally you're working together with other institutions like the Ministry of Education and also the Ministry of Public Safety. Because I did my driver license in 1981 in Germany, and we were supposed to have a basic life support before we got our license. And this has been implemented 36 years ago. So I don't think we have to invent very much. We just have to copy what has been done in Germany and Arizona, as mentioned by Dr. Khan. But at the same time, we should think about also that we have to facilitate help to come in order to have a successful CPR eventually. And I found in India, for example, in Delhi, they have made a lane in the middle of the road, which is only for police and emergency services. So I think we have to think much wider in the aspect also of city planning in the future, that we facilitate movement of emergency services throughout the city. And I think this will very much improve the rate of people who will survive it. And of course, I think we have to teach people also the correct way of doing chest compressions, because just doing chest compression isn't enough, isn't it? Because I can imagine that somebody who's been instructed by an operator to start chest compressions, you wouldn't really know where to start. So I think your plan for teaching school children is excellent. Exactly. I was also very happy that finally we have initiated wearing our seatbelts in front, although I can't understand why they didn't extend this to the back seat, because if the front people stop while traveling at 100 kilometers per hour, the back seat people will meet them at 100 kilometers per hour and behind. So I hope that we will extend it to the back seat as well, so that future car crashes and accidents will be not needing seatbelts in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muhammad, for your comment. And I think we need to have good communication, actually. I can tell you, we need your ideas, we need your involvement, actually, even active involvement. Not Dr. Muhammad only, but even those, I am sure that your presence today is your enthusiasm to help in propagation of this science and propagation of training and so on, okay? So we are willing really to have that active communication, and thank you very much.
Who is, I think, he's a Doctor Without Borders, حقيقة طبيب بلا حدود. Sky is the limit, the effort he has done and he's still doing. I was involved in the concept of registration at 11 Fine Arts since year 2000, but I never felt it's getting too close just to reach that thing rather than these days with his efforts. Thank you so much, Dr. Abdul-Majid, and lots of effort has been done. My first talk is going to be about oxygen dilemma. Can too much of oxygen kill? Oxygen dilemma actually started with the oxygen invention itself, because Joseph Priestley, he claimed he was in 1772, he was the first person to invent oxygen or to isolate oxygen from mercuric acid. Whereas Carl Scheele in Uppsala in Sweden, he said he did the same thing a year before them in Sweden. And actually he did, but Joseph Priestley, he took the credit as inventor of oxygen in 1773 because he was the first to publish that he did extracted the oxygen from mercuric acid by heating the mercuric acid in sunlight. And Scheele, he called it fire air because he thought if you put that gas on the candlelight gets brighter and stronger. And then the oxygen came from another guy, third guy in Paris, Antoine Lavoisier. He called it oxygen, which is two words from the Greek language. Oxy, which is acid, gen and taste, because he thought this is the base of all acids in the world, the oxygen. And funny enough, it's still valid till today, oxygen, which is taste of acid, because they never thought it's an oxygen vital for life. So it was a dilemma right from the beginning of the invention of oxygen. This project, I have nothing really to, nothing to explain. It's not paid or supported by anybody. Now, usually doctors, I mean, in my country, same thing when I worked in the UK, I would guess here, but in general, we are very good at reaction. and doing actions, we are really poor society doctors. And you know, when there is, for example, any operative death or mistakes or wrongdoing has been published in papers, immediately we rush in as doctors to put bylaws and etc., etc. So all the time we have been very good in reaction, but doing actions, we are not that good. So we knew all the time, since we were medical students, that too much oxygen is not good for babies. And it causes so many problems with babies. Too much oxygen is not good for lungs. It collapses the lungs. But we haven't done too much about it, really. And the first time when it came in, Victoria Stern was, when she wrote in October 2008, without it, cell die. With too much, they die even faster for oxygen. And who's Victoria Stern? Victoria Stern she's a science health writer, editor-instructor on Airway in the UK, and her main interest, fortunate or unfortunate for us, in medicine, neuroscience, psychology, and she works a lot as a contributor, editor, freelancer writer, in so many papers, Mind, Medscape, even worse, Reuters Health, General Surgery News, scientist, you name it. So she picks everything in medicine all around, and she's a freelancer, she's writing, she writes everything. So we showed that. Became a reaction from our part as doctor, as I said, we moved well before she wrote that in 2008. And what she said, oxygen is vital for life. Without it, severe brain damage may occur as little as 3 minutes, as we've been shown in previous slides. So doctors routinely treat trauma such as heart attack, stroke by providing victims with more oxygen. And yet there is mounting evidence to suggest, however, that resuscitating with too much of gas may actually have a harmful effect of oxygen. Now, a few months earlier, the researcher at the University of Texas, Medical Center, and they reported in journal Cerebral Blood Flow and Medicine in March, that's 5 months before even Victoria said that resuscitating baby mice with more oxygen, it did cause more brain damage, cerebral palsy-like problems as compared with mice that breathe air during resuscitation. And this is probably informs Professor Carr with chest compression only. And that done by Stephen Kearney, who was associate professor in cell biology, and quote what he said, our results are contrary to what one would expect because we give them too much oxygen. As many think oxygen does not hurt, and you can give as much as possible, or as much as high. 80% is good, no, you can give 90%, 90%, but doesn't increase to 100%. And quote again, our study shows this notion is wrong. Then again came in from Lens Becker in Pennsylvania, who raised the important possibility doctors that are treating patients the wrong way. Are we? I mean, our job is, I'm an anesthetist as a region and as a resuscitation. All my life I've been providing oxygen for patients, and I thought more oxygen, better patient, or even at one stage I've heard late Michael Jackson himself in a room filled with oxygen because I thought oxygen is good. And what he said similarly showed that cells were much more likely to die after being re-exposed to oxygen than they were being deprived of oxygen. And then I'm sure all of you they heard about reconditioning of cells of the brain when they are exposed to insult of a little bit of hypoxia. In fact, physicians don't know how much is too much. We never know how much of oxygen, or whether administering extra amounts actually benefit patients at all. And then, going back to stents, the news came from Reuters, as I said earlier, extra oxygen may harm emergency patients. And that was in 2012. And it came from the University in Amsterdam. The oxygen mask they strap patients rushed into ER after heart attack or stroke. It could be doing more harm than good in many cases. And research group found no support for routinely giving critically ill patients high-dose oxygen, a common practice among paramedics and emergency physicians. And that was the lead author, Schmulders, who said there is not a single study that points out to benefit effect. I mean, it's really a real surprise. We've been using oxygen, I mean, oxygen has been used since 1774, but real use of oxygen was in the First Great War, 1917, by Halden, and we know about Halden effect. And we've been using it since that time, and yet not a good randomized control trial to show us benefits of high, talking about high concentration of oxygen. All of the evidence that we found points to detrimental effect rather than good effect of oxygen. Again, most doctors believe extra oxygen is life-saving, and many guidelines recommend it. If you look at the books all the time, airway, breathing, and now, 2017, Dr. Khan just mentioned probably he's putting circulation before airway because the recommendation all the time being oxygen first. So what you would expect, that oxygen is healthy because all recommendations, all oxygen all the time is there. But what he said, but it seems that God didn't introduce 20% oxygen from air just for one, which I think it's enough oxygen from air. Probably if you use a little bit, that's good, but 100% oxygen definitely is not good. All the human research I could find on supplemented oxygen after heart attack, strokes, cardiac arrest, and acute attacks of COPD come up with all have the same grand message. Supplemental oxygen does not work. And even worse, evidence that might be harmful again. I think it's about time that we step away from your instinct approach and look at the evidence. And really, this is the evidence age, evidence era, and we should look at the evidence of supplementing oxygen, what does to our patients.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I wish I was going to talk about the DNR policy. We have experts here that can talk about it. I will talk about patient safety in CPR, but I love to be part of the discussion about patient safety in DNR.
I would like to apologize because I was told that there will be shift of speakers.
We wanted to confuse you. That's
okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so it is patient safety and CPR. Right.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أنا دائما أحب أبدأ بالآية هذه الآية رقم 32 من سورة المائدة. الله عز وجل يقول ومن أحياها فكأنما أحيا الناس جميعا. So for those who don't speak Arabic, this is a verse from Quran, which the translation of is, if you save one life, it's as if you save the lives of all mankind. So this does not get any kind of closer to the truth when we discuss CPR. Because CPR is you're dealing with someone who's in basically in a very difficult situation. So I'm going to start with this clinical scenario. 45-year-old, multiple comorbidities. We see a lot of those, and it's been complaining of some chest pain, and this is an inpatient, and then he goes into a cardiac arrest. The Code Blue team is called in, they do CPR, and they connect him to the monitor, and he's in VFib. So defibrillation was attempted, didn't work. It did not actually charge, so it did not that they defibrillated and it didn't work. So there was no electricity. At the end of the day, they found out that the defibrillator pads and the box were not compatible. So ask yourself, and again, I'm kind of getting, I know that this is a CPR conference, but I'm kind of adding the CPR is part of ACLS, so the whole idea is, are we being prepared? I'm going to share another story of a brother of a close friend of mine. So this is a true story. He had multiple comorbidities, and he arrested at home. And when the Red Crescent came in, they were doing CPR, I think, for probably about a half an hour. So his brother, who was a physician, walks in, and he found out that they're doing the CPR while his dying brother was on a couch. So he would, talk about ineffective CPR. So that's, and we could go on and on about different examples, but this is a true story, and his brother ended up dying. So what I'm going to talk about is basically three areas. So I will just discuss some basics of patient safety. And then I'm going to talk about this new organization called the Saudi Patient Safety Center, which is now about 8 months old. And then we'll talk about patient safety in CPR to finish with. So last year, the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, this study came out and say that in the United States, 251,000 people die from medical errors, which made medical errors the third cause of death in the States. Basically, if you assume, and that's a big if, that the healthcare system in Saudi is similar to the healthcare system in the US, just do the math, at least 22,000 people die every year in this country from medical errors, which comes down to 60 to 70 people dying every day. So today, around 60 or 70 people, I can tell you probably more. If you really choose apply the definition of medical errors, which are all kinds of medical errors, I can tell you today they will die, more than 60 or 70 people will die from medical errors. That's the tip of the iceberg. So death is the ultimate harm that can happen to patients, but then you've got major harm that does not amount to death, and you've got minor harm, and then we've got the near misses and adverse behaviors. So, and medical errors are a major problem worldwide. So this is not a unique Saudi problem. This is not a unique US problem. It's pretty much, it's a healthcare system problem, and we have a lot of room for improvement to move away from some of the risky practices and try to minimize the harm. So the cost of medical errors, when there was a study that came out of the US as well that talks about each year the lost productivity for someone is $100,000 US. But then that's just the direct cost. So we're looking at someone who is going to be admitted for a couple of days and ends up being admitted for 2-3 months. So we just got, these studies just look at the medical and pharmaceutical costs. But then, again, that's another tip of an iceberg, because you've got the indirect cost and the opportunity cost as well that you want to keep in mind. Another principle I think that is important to explain is each knife has a blunt end and a sharp end, right? So when we deal, I always tell people that have no good understanding of, of trying to explain medical errors. To have a medical error, you have to have a patient and you have to have a healthcare professional. So unfortunately, we healthcare professionals, we're on the sharp end. So, and when something happens, there's a lot of shaming and blaming that takes place. Think of the case, the HIV transmission case in Jeddah 4 or 5 years ago. What ended up happening to that blood bank technician? He got fired. But then people on the blunt end, who fired him? People on the blunt end. So people on the blunt end, that starts, and I've explained this even to the Minister of Health. The blunt end starts from the Minister of Health all the way down to the deputies, to the directorate, the directors, the CEO of hospitals, department heads, unit heads, etc., etc. So even though that people at the blunt end are not necessarily involved directly with patients, they can have a major impact. You know, I'm a hepatobiliary surgeon and I'm still practicing. If this the resource committee and the finance people did not help us with medical devices, and then I end up harming patients, yes, I have some blame to shoulder, but then what about the blame of the people in the finance department, or what about the blame of the CEO? And again, it's not blame. I don't like to use the word blame. It's more of an accountability. But then when you think about any medical error that takes place, you know, think about through all these different layers. The Swiss cheese model. A very smart scientist, James Reason, explained this framework, and again, it came out of other industries, not the healthcare industry. But this explains a very common thing that we do on a daily basis as clinicians. How from prescribing a medication all the way to administration, and then you could go that. So the framework is for each layer of the Swiss cheese should be kind of a barrier to prevent harm, and then the Swiss cheese has these holes in it. I've visited the Saudi Aramco, the oil and gas Saudi Aramco, with experts from the WHO in January of this year, and they take this model and they take safety seriously, and that's why, you know, the oil and gas is a very, very safe industry. Every day there are thousands of drilling operations worldwide in the oil and gas industry, and how many disasters do we see? Very, very, very few. When disasters happen in the oil and gas, you know, they're big, but they're very few because they take safety very seriously. And when you talk to them, it's like this metaphor and this model is pretty much printed in their head. We, on the other hand, in healthcare, we have fewer slices and bigger holes, so maybe 2 or 3 slices, and so to improve safety, always think, how can you add extra layers of safety in different processes, whether it's a medication ordering or whether it's advanced cardiac life support or basic life support, etc. So think of Swiss cheese model in CPR, and many of us are pretty much traumatized the first time we witness a code blue as students. It's for the most part, whether you're a medical student or a nursing student, that experience is traumatizing, because unless you're in one of the kind of a very advanced healthcare medical centers, it is a very chaotic scene. And you know, you've got someone who's trying to die, and then you've got all these different, not very well coordinated activities for the most part, and so many people just trying to do so many things. So these are some of the basics of patient safety that I think are important. Next, I'm going to talk about the Saudi Patient Safety Center. So we're part of the National Patient Safety Program 2020. There were many initiatives that came out of the National Transformation Program, the NTP 2020, and in different sectors, and we were born out of one of them. We're not the Ministry of Health. I always say that we're an independent entity. We do get our budget through the Ministry of Health, but we have the kind of separate governance. We have a board that has representation from all sectors, and we make sure that we have someone from the Consumer Protection Agency that sits on the board to represent the public. And the board is chaired by His Excellency the Minister of Health. I was given the honor to lead this organization, and I also sit on the board. So our vision is very simple: safe healthcare for all, and our mission is to eliminate preventable harm in the Saudi healthcare system by working. Think about it by working through three main channels and three main stakeholders. So working with the regulators, we've got a lot of work that we're undergoing with the Saudi FDA, with the Saudi Commission for Healthcare Specialties, with the Ministry of Health, so with all the regulators, with Sibahi. Second is working with the providers, either private or public. And we even include community pharmacies as part of the providers. And third is working directly with the public through patient empowerment. I think the more empowered patients are, the safer the healthcare system is, and the safer the encounters are for patients. We've got 4 values, and one of them, which we're going to be talking about a lot, is patient-centered care. So the more we push towards patient-centered care, the safer the healthcare system is. The better the quality, the less the cost. Many industries are customer-centered, and unfortunately in healthcare we're not. If we are, you don't end up having a surgical department and an anesthesia department and a medicine department. And so I call our industry a physician-centered care, or dare I say egocentric industry. So how can we push towards more patient-centered care? So right now, patients and families are the weakest link in the equation. How can we empower patients? And empowering patients is going to be very helpful. We've got many examples that we can talk about when it comes to empowerment. CPR. So as you know, you've got different patient groups. You've got the adult groups, and these algorithms keep changing, and you've got the AHA and SHA, and then everyone has, I think, their own thing. In addition, you've got algorithms for adults, you've got algorithms for pediatrics, and you've got algorithms for neonates. So at each one of those boxes, things could go wrong, and my brother is a pilot in Saudi Airlines, and aviation industry is a very safe industry. The likelihood of dying on an airplane is less than 1 in 20 million. The likelihood of dying as a patient in our hospitals is 1 in 300, and it can be even worse. So. The aviation industry does a lot of training. So it's not, so we've got these algorithms, but then you can ask ourselves, how much training are we doing? We could talk about not just CPR, but we can talk about many other kind of complex things that we do. Talk about the operating room. We've got the anesthesia tribes, and we've got the surgeon tribes, and we've got the nurses tribes, and are we actually training together? Let alone even individually, how much training are we doing, kind of a simulation-based training to potential problems. So when it comes to errors, whether medical errors or others, there are 2 types of errors in CPR. There are errors of commission and errors of omission. So think about it through the ABCs. So, so errors of omission is basically something that you should be doing that you didn't do, and errors of commission is something that you should not be doing that you're doing. So when it comes to an airway, an errors of omission is not opening the airway, especially when you're dealing with younger, smaller patients. That becomes something very important. And even though we freak out when we have someone crashing, but we forget that we could just open the airway until Dr. Abdelakaki comes in and helps us with intubation. But so we just forget the very basics of just opening the airway. So with breathing, ambu-bagging is an art, and I always love to look at how we learn from our colleagues in anesthesia how they do the ambu-bagging. But it's always good when you're doing it on the mannequin to see that if the airway is not open, or if you don't have a good seal, then you're not doing effective kind of breathing or ambu-bagging. And then the chest compression, and I did mention that true story of this, my friend's brother who died, and the Red Crescent were there, where they were physically there, and they were doing ineffective CPR for half an hour. So think about it, even in your own hospital, are people prepared and they know what they do in those situations? Errors of commission is the opposite, so something that you shouldn't be doing that you end up doing. You closing the airway, and again, think about the opposite of what we mentioned in terms of omission. The CRM principles, the crew resource management principles of the aviation industry, is something that I think we can learn a lot from. I think the more we train on these different algorithms, the more prepared we are to deal with situations, and the smoother these code blue processes take place. I think we need to do a lot of simulation-based training, especially now with the number of trainees not having enough clinical experience, and how can you make sure that they still do get minimum level of competency to make them safe. But again, it goes beyond the healthcare professionals, but at least just as a start, it is important to keep training and training and training. So that's pretty much it. What I told you in the past 20 minutes is we talked about some patient safety principles. We talked about those blunt end and sharp end. We talked about the Swiss cheese model. Talked about the numbers from the States, and how is that even just does not tell the whole story. That's just the tip of the iceberg. We talked about the economics of patient safety, and how we only just have measure a fraction of what the real cost is. I did talk about the Saudi Patient Safety Center. Every day I ask my team to ask themselves these two questions, and how many lives can we save, how much harm can we prevent? And I think coordinating with all the stakeholders, working with everyone, trying to improve safety is something that would eventually will improve the patient safety movement in the kingdom. We did talk about patient safety and CPR, thinking through the different algorithms for different groups. And I think training is extremely important. You know, we've got the errors of commission and errors of omission. I want to finish off with something that is important for not just for CPR, but I think for safety culture in the kingdom. And we did have a discussion with Dr. Abdullah just a few minutes ago about this. We have a deficit of safety culture in our society. You know, think about our schools. Think about our shopping malls. You know, think about our mosques. Are we prepared in those areas that if someone had an emergency that we could deal with them? Think about in a restaurant, if someone is eating and they choke on a piece of food. Does anyone know how to do a Heimlich maneuver correctly? Do we know how we can do a Heimlich maneuver for a child, for a pediatric age? So one of the things that we're interested in doing, and we did actually start some steps towards that, is to have to spread the safety culture through first aid, through CPR training at communities beyond healthcare. So the Minister of Health has written officially to the Minister of Labor and to the Minister of Education, and we're working with our colleagues, Dr. Abdul Khan and the Saudi Health Association. I think we can claim that at some point that we can have schools that have the majority having basic first aid and CPR. We can have the household support, so either the maids or the drivers that could also have CPR. We could link CPR to a driving license. So spreading the base of the number of people that actually do CPR is going to be very beneficial, not just from a CPR standpoint, but I think it will have a spillover effect on the culture of safety.
Action to continue or not to continue. And we are doing this. It is not accepted at all, and we have seen this in some scenarios, to leave the patient, go to the computer, open the file, see the prognosis, see the pathology, open the results as long as VF. But I want to tell you something. Me and another consultant cardiologist, for the first time ever in my life, we stayed 50 minutes in VF. We tried everything you can imagine, and patient was in VF. But as long as there is VF, of course, we are going to continue. The hard talk actually is not important. And the physician, they will behave that he cannot do the DNR at all. So what is DNR? DNR is a decision to protect patients from aggressive, undignified, unnatural death. Make it nice like politicians like this. The DNR is not to do CPR, no, it's to allow natural death. This is the DNR. The DNR is not denying treatment for the patient, no. You are actually giving benefit to the patient and his family. But before DNR, diagnosis should be firmly established and the pathology of the disease should be very clear. The physician must have a thorough understanding of the pathophysiology. Resuscitation proving to be of benefit, the individual will suffer poor quality after this. This is all essential before the consultant, and of course it is a consultant decision, it is not a specialist decision. The decision to limit life-sustaining support should probably occur as early in the course of the illness as possible. It is a responsibility that many of us as a physician trying to escape from. Yes, early DNR is a responsibility that physicians tend to ignore. Here, a survey of the key opinion leaders on ethical resuscitation practice in 31 European countries. This is the leaders. According to the key expert, ethical practice emergency care is still vary across Europe. Still vary regarding the policy and regarding everything. And this is care of terminal ill patient. Opinion survey among the Middle East is still the same. Training background and level of seniority in critical care provider does not impact the opinion. He was trained in Canada, he was trained in US, he was trained here locally. All of them, the society are deep in their brain. And they are not going to have maybe all the same, they will do the same regarding the DNR policy. Here is awareness of non-resuscitation order in the outpatient, of course, is more worse. In Saudi Arabia and most of the others, the issue of the DNR among the outpatient and clinics is very poorly understood. This is a book of resuscitation, and I brought that just to go through all this table among all the European countries. There is no homogeneous at all regarding the definition of DNR. Some people will just, if you decide you can, by themselves, you can overcome the patient and his family. There is no familiarity among also the European countries. In the medical law, these advanced DNR decisions are made only in the minority of cases. Only 16% of the physicians practicing in this survey estimated they had discussed DNR approximately 5 to 10 times during the past year. Don't think that I'm going to read all of this. But just most emergency physicians attempt to resuscitate patients in cardiopulmonary risk regardless of poor outcome, except in cases where the DNR is there. So we should ask ourselves why we are reluctant to put the patient DNR. It's personal beliefs, maybe, due to some religious, also we'll see this later, some society issues. His personal belief is not going to put the patient DNR. Maybe a professional oath, how can I put a patient, I deny medication for the patients. Or maybe his fears from the law, from the family, from whatever, he will not put the patient a DNR. This is why the physicians are. But now come to the issue. If you, as a physician, being in this terminal illness, do you accept to be treated undignified process like this? In this very nice paper, most of the physicians, if they are in their terminal illness, they will refuse and they want the DNR for themselves. So why doctors are afraid to put the patients and just put the patient in undignified death? And when we ask the physician, do you agree for yourself? He will say, no, I want a natural death and not to go into this miserable ICU stay for long days. This study raises questions about why doctors provide care to their patient, which is very different from what they choose for themselves, and also what seriously ill patients want. The DNR care, at the other hand, is very important. DNR is not an execution order. DNR doesn't mean don't to treat. So the patients on DNR should receive antibiotics, some vasopressors, and all of this. The other issue, DNR should never convey sense of giving up to the patients, family member, and most importantly, the rest of the healthcare staff. Believe it or not, we as a senior staff, a consultant or senior staff in the hospital, when you give your negative impact about the prognosis of the patient to the nurse will behave with the patient with this. This negative issue should not be translated at all to the nursing staff where they are treating the patient. I was asked to see a patient in the medical ward. When I went there, I told the nurse, where is my patient? She said, next to the closed curtain. So I told her, who is behind the closed curtain? She told me, it is a DNR patient. The DNR patient is not behind the curtain. This is a very important issue. The DNR patient should be reviewed. It's just not to close us. It is not finished. It should be reviewed, and this patient should be treated dignity. We are putting him DNR actually to have a nature of this and not to be ignored. DNR is a human with heart and soul. It doesn't mean at all that DNR is a dead body. We should be from both sides very ethical and very balancing this issue. You can place your hands on a DNR patient, yes. You can start CPR if he has something like shocking, anaphylactic or anything, you can treat him. If he had steam invasion, myocardial infarction, we took to the cath lab DNR patient and we opened the arteries. You can temporarily also hold the DNR and take the patient to the cath lab. There is a nice term called restricted CPR. And restricted CPR, I think the anesthesia people and the intensivist is facing it. They will bring me and see a patient in the ICU, in ventilator, full support, everything, 22 lines, maybe 50 things among him. Dr. Dean, can you put him DNR? What DNR? You are doing everything for him. So these patients, for example, was restricted. If he developed VF, shock him. If he has history, may not do anything for him. This is for the restricted CPR. Who should decide for DNR? I said the most senior physician responsible for the patient should decide, but he shouldn't take it over his shoulder. And it is something, it is not a law or it is not something we can enforce it, but I never took a DNR for my patient alone. I will bring Abdullah, what we think, this is the situation, this is what we think about this, we'll bring a family, we'll bring everything, and then we'll use the issue, we will decide the DNR. You should get another opinion to put your mind at ease. Here is a very nice statement, inevitably judgment will have to be made, and will be a gray area, of course, for the DNR issue. Come to the most important issue for some people, is DNR matching with Islamic ethical rules or not? Our Prophet said, none of you should wish for death because of a calamity befalling him. But if he has to wish for this, he should say, oh Allah, keep me alive as long as life is better for me, and leave me to die if death is better for me. This is summarizing the whole issue of the DNR. The DNRs allow the nature of this. Whatever death is better for the patient, you allow the nature of death. You don't interrupt the issue. This is a very nice book written by an Italian guy about Islamic bioethics problems and perspectives. I encourage all of you to try to read this one. He wrote in the introduction, it is impossible not to be impressed by the plurality of ethical and juridical positions within Islam on many issues and aspects of bioethics, both from the theoretical and practical point of views. So don't misunderstand the religion and say, no, I'm not going to do this because this is against my belief. It is not against your belief. It is not imperative on a Muslim to seek remedy except in life-saving situations and where the illness is infectious and is going to affect the community. Any Muslim has the right to refuse them except if life-saving. And life-saving, you should give him. But if he has an infectious disease, for example, he should be enforced to be treated, because here the rule of the no harm is important. If the treating physician finds a certain modality of treatment useless or going to increase the suffering of the patient, that modality should not be started from the start, putting the no harm above all. Also, not only we should respect the DNR, but even our courts say even the dead body should be treated in respect. So what about the DNR patients? Now come to the Presidential of Administration of Islamic Research. This is something very long, that if 3 physicians, knowledgeable and trustworthy physicians agree that the patient condition is hopeless, the life supporting machines can be withheld or withdrawn, the family member opinion is not included in decision making, and they are unqualified to make such decisions. All of us facing this. When you try to be democratic and try to avoid this, try to discuss with the family that they in the heart, and they will say no. So what you can say? Now we have a problem because sometimes now we go up with the admin to try to stop this. Also, should be, all of us are aware that in the Muslim and Arab countries, the family can overcome the decision of the patient and can take the decision. So, just here I'm opening some introduction that teaching the skills in the only CPR, BLS, and ECMS courses is not enough. It's not enough to teach him to jump on the chest of the patient. We should know which patient to jump on with the chest, and if it's going to be futile, give the patient benefit or not. And at the end, let us get the ethics very clear here. Both medical and economic factors should be considered when.
In fact, the only thing I wait for when somebody fibrillates in the cath lab is for them to pass out. I don't think it's nice to shock somebody awake. You wait 2 to 5, 7 seconds and they close their eyes, then I actually just cardiac at that point, and it works almost every time. Unmonitored cardiac arrest, when there's no AED present, we still believe at the American Heart that it's reasonable to do chest compressions until the device is retrieved. And in fact, it really became an issue for us a few years ago. In Tucson, we kept records of our AED experience with the fire department, and in 61 consecutive cases, when we were still talking about defib first, above and beyond everything, we never had a successful cardioversion or defibrillation tool for fusing rhythm. When somebody has been in VF and nothing's been done for them for 5 or 10 minutes, you can eliminate the VF by a shock, but it never restores a pulse. And so I've become a firm believer, in spite of the fact that the ROC study did not show a difference with 3 minutes, or actually 180 seconds of chest compressions before shock. I still believe in that circumstance it helps. You have to change the ischemic milieu of the myocardium if it's going to respond to the shock and start beating again. So that was this statement that while it's being retrieved, certainly do chest compressions. There are new technologies that can take out the chest compression artifact, but the clinical studies yet are pretty scant. And so the statement was, we don't know what to do yet with those, but they're coming and they work very well experimentally, which will allow us to know while we're doing compressions if they've gone back into VF and need a shock, rather than just finish our 2 minutes and then look. Nothing really new about energies, whether you have fixed energy devices or escalating. We generally just put it to the maximal energy level and begin to defibrillate. And finally, as you know, we changed a few years ago away from the stacked 3 shocks to a single shock, and that still seems to be a very reasonable approach. Now the ERC actually differs just a slight bit. For example, defibrillation should not be delayed for CPR any longer than the time needed to obtain an AED or defibrillator. Again, our experience in Arizona is that it's very helpful to do a few minutes of CPR before defibrillation if nothing's been done to that patient in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. If good bystander CPR has been done, then we don't wait. We instruct our firefighters to shock immediately as soon as they arrive. The ERC also thought that direct contact between the CPR provider and the victim should be avoided during defibrillation. That's the statement that kind of says we're not sure about this hands-on defibrillation. But the actual data for that looks pretty encouraging, particularly if you have on latex gloves. It's certainly not a huge risk to the rescuer. And though you may feel a tingle, you do not fly across the room if you're touching the patient when the shock is performed. And they believe that 3 shocks may still be useful if it was a witnessed arrest, for example, in the cath lab, and the first shock doesn't work. Rather than stop and do 2 minutes of CPR, they believe that you ought to try 2 or 3 more shocks before. I'm not sure about that, and maybe I'll get back to that as we talk about the cath lab circumstance. And finally, that the energy levels, whether you start at 150 or 200 or even 300, is really your choice. There's no data to support any being superior. Well, here's what I'd like to talk about, and that's some recent reports on successful defibrillation programs. One that's really remarkable in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Another is a very nice update on the use of AEDs on commercial airlines. And then just this last year, a wearable defibrillator was approved and actually given the blessing of the American Heart and the European resuscitation communities. I'm going to talk then about optimizing defibrillation when the VF appears to be refractory and it's not responding to shock. And then finally, what's on the near horizon for defibrillation? I have been going to Brazil for about 20 years. I started by helping them establish a national CPR training program in the 90s. But it's been a challenge, and the challenge is simply this. These are mega metropolises. Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, they're cities of, literally, as you can see here, the metro area of Sao Paulo today has 22 million people. And traffic is a huge issue. So you may do everything right, shout, get help, start CPR, but the help doesn't arrive for 45 minutes or 60 minutes. So we've struggled to improve survival under those circumstances. And in fact, it's been very hard to even get numbers, but the best we know is in the city of Sao Paulo, the overall survival rate for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest is less than 2%. It's really awful. But it's not their fault per se. It's just, again, the challenges of such big cities. And frankly, that's not much different than Chicago or New York City 10, 15 years ago. Well, we finally came up with the idea that at least one thing we could do, and pattern this project after what was done in airports, was to put defibrillators where lots of people go every day. And in Sao Paulo, that's the subway system. Literally millions of riders every day, and they had never had, at that time, a successful save for anybody who rested on the subway. They get 4.5 million passengers per day. There's 58 stations. You don't really need to memorize the city lines, but what we did was we simply took defibrillators, automatic AEDs, put them on the subway, and then trained the subway personnel to defibrillate. We didn't even train them to do CPR, just to defibrillate. Well, here's what we found over about a 6-year period. 102 sudden collapses. Some of those were not cardiac arrest, as you can see. 86 were. We were only really interested in the VF because the defibrillator is not going to do much for pulseless or asystole. There were 62 victims of VF over that 6-year period. 70% of all cardiac arrest. Why is that number so high when generally it's not? Because you're right there to put the device on, and it got on literally in 4 minutes. Of those 62, 45 or 73% had return to spontaneous circulation. A few died, but as you can see, 35 or 55% were admitted alive, and 23 survived the discharge in even to 1 year, or 37%. Remember, there was 0%, to the best of our knowledge, before. Well, here's some of the characteristics of those 62. About 60 years old, 75%, 77% male. That's pretty true in all out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. It happens more often in males than females. The interval from collapse to first defibrillation was basically 5 minutes, 20 minutes. Again, in general, in the city, up on the ground level, not in the subway, it's 30 to 60 minutes. And yet it was still another 16 minutes from collapse to the arrival of EMS. So if you look at that, they saved 11 minutes to defibrillation by putting these devices on the subway itself. In the very beginning, before we really got started in the first year and a half, there were only 8 cases and we really weren't doing much yet. So we actually looked at that as almost our control period. As you can see, there were 0 survivors out of those 8. Over the next 4 years, there were 54 cases and 23 survivors, or 43%. It was remarkable what they achieved as they really got this program going. And when you compare it to other targeted AED programs, Chicago Airport was the one, the New England Journal a few years ago, you can see that, frankly, they're pretty close. Not quite as good as Chicago, but definitely as good as London and Osaka. Really a remarkable achievement, again, for a city that had struggled to make any dent in sudden cardiac death. Well, why do I bring this up? Because I think it's a great model, not only for other South American large cities, but really throughout the world. Brazil has many resources, but they're not evenly distributed. And this is a great example, I think, of a public health initiative that really had impact. Well, you know, if you're going to buy a home in Jeddah, in Medina, it's all about location, right? That's the rule for real estate. Location, location, location. But it's also true for cardiac arrest. Where do you want to have your cardiac arrest? Most people say Seattle. Sometimes they now say Arizona. But what if you have it on the way to Seattle or on the way to the U.S. at 35,000 feet? All commercial airliners now carry AEDs. This is an example of the galley of, I assume, just a mock setup, but this is how it goes. Well, the very again, if you've got a non-shockable rhythm, it doesn't matter if you go to the ground early, you're not going to survive. If you have a shockable, you actually get shocked in the air, and typically you respond. If you don't respond, then you basically become a non-shockable rhythm. You went from your VF to a PEA. And again, then the outcome is very poor. It's interesting because I looked into this a few years ago when I was asked by the pilot, should I go down early? It's a $60,000 to $100,000 decision. You've got to dump all your fuel. If you show up at an airport that was not expecting you, there's a huge fine, and you have to pay to land. So it's not a trivial decision. And I think this is the kind of data that's very helpful to make legitimate scientific decisions, that there's no reason to do that very often. Well, there are really 2 ways that happens. One is it's truly refractory VF and it's just not responding, or it's recurrent and it actually does defibrillate but immediately reoccurs. Same problem for you, they're still in VF, but treatments might actually be slightly different. What's become very popular with minimal data in the US is this dual sequential or double sequential defibrillation. So, as you may know by the obesity problem in the US motto is, if some good, more is better. So if one shock is over, then let's give 2 shocks. So they put 2 defibrillators, 2 separate AED pads, and then they try to push the buttons at the same time. In reality, that rarely works. You just aren't that accurate. And so it's probably much more like B, that it's 1 and then very quickly, a few microseconds later, a second defibrillation pulse. But there are case reports. This was the first, back in 2014, a 50-year-old with acute MI who actually did not respond to repeated single shock, single device, and with 2 defibrillators after 2 shocks did. Certainly no proof, but published. Here was 10, a case series, and notice that frankly though, they defibrillated in 70% of the cases, nobody survived. And then here's a 2-year retrospective, about 50 cases, and again, pretty scant. No real difference in ROSC, whether they got dual sequential or standard, and no difference in outcome. I actually think that this is not the answer, but that when we really have VF that's not responsive, we have to think why. And most of the time it's because, again, the underlying myocardial milieu will not respond, and that's usually because of overwhelming ischemia. So again, confession, I'm an interventional cardiologist, but I think the right answer for refractory VF is to fix the coronary tree, because it's almost always the cause. So how do you do that? Well, the current way now is to support these patients on the way from the field to the hospital with good CPR in the back of an ambulance, usually meaning, as we spoke yesterday, a mechanical chest compressor. And then once at the medical facility, up in the ante and providing artificial circulation with some form of left ventricular assist, or even a full circulatory pump, mechanical pump, such as ECMO. But this is a slippery slope, because clearly this is expensive, clearly this is big time invasive, and you have to pick the right patients. Not everybody is eligible for this, in my opinion. Let's talk, this came up yesterday, so I put these slides in last evening. Then, what about CPR in the ambulance? You know, it's been looked at mostly with mannequin studies. So these are true ambulances in traffic, but with not true patients with a mannequin, just like we're doing out here at our teaching course. But what they found was clearly it's very tough to do good CPR. The CPR fraction is almost always less than 50%, and often very shallow compared to what you would normally do. Mechanical devices solve that, no question. Whether the auto pulse or Lucas or thumper, it doesn't really matter. If you put them on and leave them on, they solve those two problems. And the safety factor has been nicely shown. It is a real issue in the US where if you're injured on the job, you will be compensated. So people are very careful about requiring ambulance services, as in this one photo, to be standing up, trying to do CPR without driving to the hospital. Well, there are two, I want to just, in the last few minutes, just talk about or show you some data from 2 series of this approach. One was from Australia, the CHEER trial, and it was really just a phase 1, just 26 patients, and in fact, only 11 with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And as you follow down by that red arrow, here's the 11 patients, all in VF. 9 of them got on to ECMO. 8 had return of spontaneous circulation, and 5 survived. So 5 of 11, about 45 to 50%. Minnesota, Dimitri Yiannopoulos, an interventional cardiologist there, has just published this year, their experience, and they had 18 patients, very similar. They support them with Lucas in transport. They put ECMO on in the cath lab, and then they follow up with PCI. When you combine those 2 experiences, it gives you 29 patients. 52% had 24-hour survival, and 93% of the survivors were neurologically intact. It's pretty remarkable for this sick group. In fact, I've talked to Dimitri subsequently, and they have doubled their numbers to 34. So now if you look, it's 45 total patients in the world's experience, 51% survival rate, and 91% intact survivors neurologically. So people still die, but if you live, you're not brain damaged if you do it in the right sequential way. Well, finally, what's on the near horizon? I actually think it's this. I think we'll be asking for a defibrillator just in time, just when we need it, and it will fly to us in the near future. But this is obviously just one. I think this is a Scandinavian drone that's delivering such. Here's the defibrillator there in the red case. And this I took right off the YouTube. I couldn't figure out how to get the video, so I just took a still. But here it arrives. Here it's going on. And science fiction? Probably not. This was an article just in CERP this last year from Canada. It's not actually patient experience, but it's a mathematical model of what it would take, how many defibrillators and drones and where, to actually make this happen. We are getting really close, and I know at least in the same area by Toronto, they have started. Well, if I could leave a message this morning, it would be targeted AED programs work. It's the low-hanging fruit. If you're struggling in your community to up the ante and improve survival, this is something you should look at and see, is there something we can do, whether in Jeddah or wherever, that would at least offer AED treatment to the many people who go through the airport or whatever. That's why I was absolutely intrigued yesterday to hear about this Heart Saver program for the pilgrimage to Mecca. I think that is a fabulous idea. Last night, in fact, I encouraged those involved to write that up. I think that would be a unique experience for the world to know. And I guess I'll just leave you. Oh, here we go. Yeah. If you have cardiac arrest in the air, do it early before you go to sleep so they can find you. Wearable defibrillators work. They're not the full answer. They're not easy to wear, but they work if you keep them on. Refractory VF, I'm not sure further efforts in defibrillation are worth it until you fix the underlying problem, typically a very serious acute occlusion of the left main or proximal LAD. And when you need an AED in the future, look up. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to speak with you this morning about something very interesting, and all the practitioners, especially those who deal with critically ill patients in hospitals, they are waiting for. Before I move forward, I would like to thank the organizing committee, namely Dr. Abdelmajid Khan for his kind invitation. And I think this conference very timely with the approval of the national DNR policy. What I'm gonna do in this 30 minutes or less, I'm gonna give you some introduction about the background of this national policy, the methodology that we used to came up with these guidelines, and the policy statements, procedures, and some information about the task force members, the reviewers, and the institutions that reviewed the policy. Let me start by asking you, how many of you working in a hospital where there is a clear DNR policy? Raise hand, please. So this is one of the problems, especially in Saudi Arabia. We have a lack of, first of all, lack of policy, local policy in most of the hospitals. And we are not talking about the big cities. Even the hospitals in some small cities. The other thing, we don't have a national guidelines, national policy where it is clear for all medical teams, as well as the families and those engaged in the DNR situation. First of all, we started by definitions that this guidelines define it very clearly and use it as a medical term in the English as well as in the Arabic version of the guidelines. So starting by the CPR, we defined the CPR, and I think this is all clear for you. And also we defined DNR, and here I should read it for you. DNR stands for Do Not Resuscitate, which refer to that in the event of a cardiac and or pulmonary deterioration or arrest, cardiopulmonary resuscitative measures will not be initiated. So we should also define it very clear. I will not go through this. This will take time. Also, we defined limited escalation, and again, it was stated in the guidelines. We defined the attending consultant. We have to describe in which situation the initiation of DNR order has to be made after defining very clearly what we exactly mean by this. I think this is very important section. DNR initiation doesn't mean that we didn't go through the other options of management. So we put it very clear here that every patient will receive cardiopulmonary resuscitation and or other appropriate resuscitation procedures necessary to sustain the patient's life until the patient's DNR status has been confirmed. Resuscitation measures in the best judgment of the attending consultant. Doctors who decide, who initiate this order. One is the attending physician as a consultant.
Invitation and an introduction. So this early CPR and chest compression and early defibrillation is the two main interventions that will improve the survival of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And this slide is from an animal study by Professor Carl Kurz. I believe he has shown your how detrimental it is when chest compression is interrupted, either for ventilation or for fatigue. So I will not show again. So because of this, the UCOR recommended that pauses in chest compression in adult patient receive CPR with no advanced airway interruption of chest compression for delivery of true breath should be less than 10 seconds. And as well as the pre-shock pause will be as short as possible, not more than 10 seconds. And because of this detrimental effect of the stopping chest compression, and it's lead to some modification of the guideline to minimize interruption in chest compression. So a CPR should be continued during the charge phase of the defibrillator, and a post-shock immediately resume chest compression and only analyze the rhythm after 2 minutes of CPR. And there's two theories governing how does the chest compression work, and one of them, of course, is compression directly onto the heart and pump the blood to the various parts of the body. And the other theory is that of a thoracic pump theory, where the whole chest thoracic cavity work as a unit. So it compresses the blood flow to the body, and during the relaxation phase, there is negative pressure, and that causes the refilling of the heart and the return of the cardiac output. And then this prototype of this best CPR was invented, and this is like a big big blood pressure cuff, and it circumferentially compress the chest, and it believed that hemodynamically it may be better than compression, manual CPR. And again, this study shows that it improved hemodynamically. However, there's no improvement in short-term survival, as well as a return of spontaneous circulation. The study showed that there's also no significant increase in trauma. Okay, it's a training video for the auto-pulse, and where this concept developed into a commercially available mechanical CPR device.
Once ready, we will pick up the patient and slide the auto-pulse to the patient. Note that the doctor has previously placed one infant cap that detects the chest. Now the doctor will place a second defibrillation cap in the right of the chest, while nurse number 2 starts the auto-pulse device. At the same time, the doctor is evaluating the rhythm. The patient is in ventricular fibrillation, the machine is charged, and in the first shock is being delivered. Note that you do not need to stop chest compressions to deliver the shock.
Okay, and this video clip is to show that for any mechanical CPR devices, it's important to do training because it's during the application, the patient may not receive any chest compression. So it's important to shorten the interruption of chest compression as short as possible, and this can only be done by training, vigorous training. And the other device that I'm going to talk about is called the Lucas, and it first came on for this active compression decompression device, and it's first started from an articles in JAMA where someone in cardiac arrest, and then the son happened to be a plumber, so he went to the kitchen and took out this plumbing and then apply onto the chest of the victims, and there is sort of cardiac output recorded, and there's a patient survived to hospital discharge. So P stands for the plumber's help, and then they come up with this active compression decompression device, and this is a big like a suction cup which apply on the chest. So when during the decompression phase of the chest compression, it sort of suck out the chest and create a bigger negative pressure. And anyone of you have tried this device before, it's very, very laborious, very, very difficult to use. And the study shows that from this Paris SAMU out of hospital cardiac arrest, it's a sort of a pseudo-randomized study, and they found that there is improved survival, 1 year survival. However, the other study done by Ian Steele in Canada showed that this device does not improve the survival of hospital cardiac arrest. And in 2005, I believe this the first prototype of this. They make it mechanically so that they can do this suction using a machine, and this is called Lucas, Gould University Cardiopulmonary Assistance System. And these are the two randomized trial, very important randomized trial, again published in very prestigious journal like JAMA and Lancet on out-of-hospital cardiac arrest on mechanical chest compression versus conventional CPR. And this is the meta-analysis of the two studies, which shows that there is no any survival benefits for Lucas versus manual CPR. And then this is a new meta-analysis which combine all the mechanical chest compression device in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, a meta-analysis of both the randomized and observation study, and they combine the auto-pulse with Lucas. And so these are the randomized study, and these are the non-randomized study. Those indicated in the yellow triangle are that of the autopulse, and the rest are for Lucas. And this meta-analysis combined shows that there is out-of-hospital return spontaneous circulation. It favors mechanical CPR. And also survival to hospital admission also favors mechanical CPR. However, the survival to hospital discharge, there is no advantages. You can see the bar here, it did not cross the line. And the same as for favorable neurological outcome. Again, there is no benefits for mechanical CPR over manual CPR. So this is the latest evidence. So this is a video clip from my colleague from Bangkok. I want to acknowledge Dr. Nalilas. And as you can see, it is very difficult to do chest compression on a moving vehicle, and as well as quite hazardous as well. So what about adding on to a seat belt? It made things better. I think it probably improved a little bit. But however, again, the randomized study, big randomized study, shows that, and with the meta-analysis shows that there's no disadvantage of, there's no survival disadvantage of mechanical CPR. And I think probably Professor Kaufman has already spoken to you what happened if the patient developed cardiac arrest in a cath lab. All right, so in the past there's nothing much you can do. You can ask the assistant to wear a leg gown and continue chest compression while the PCI is going on. I think that is quite difficult because then you can't see the image of the coronary angiogram. So if you can use Lucas, and this video clip shows that it's successfully able to continue PCI and open up the artery. And this small case series was published for the cardiac arrest in a cath laboratory, a 5-year experience using mechanical chest compression to facilitate PCI during prolonged resuscitation effort. And Professor Kaufman is one of the authors, and they recruited patients have an episode of cardiac arrest necessitating a period of several minutes of manual chest compression, followed by the use of mechanical chest compression and then tracheal intubation. And the patient had to arrive to the cardiac cath laboratory before the episode of the tracheal intubation. And they collected a total of 6,350 PCI in the cath lab, 118 in the cardiogenic shock, and 81 required defibrillation due to VF of VT. And those who need a mechanical chest compression, actually the number is very small. It's only 43 compared with more than 6,000 procedure done in a cath lab. And then 5 of them had myocardial rupture, so it's non-survivable. And these are the indication for the cath lab procedure. Of course, STEMI is the most common, and some of them died in the cath lab, and some discharged from the cath lab and discharged from hospital alive with good neurological outcome. So 11 out of 43 actually is quite substantial. It's almost 25%. And although this is not a randomized study, I doubt it will be able to do a randomized study, but it shows that at least with mechanical chest compression, there is a patient might survive, during a PCI procedure. If without this mechanical chest compression, the patient may have a time. And so for mechanical chest compression, we overcome the reported problems with compression quality because of consistent compressions are needed to reduce fatigue in prolonged transportation, and also used in difficult circumstances, for example, limited staff numbers and also transport. Confined places, like in Singapore, we have high-rise building everywhere, and somehow the elevator is very small, and during using the elevator, it's not possible to lie the patient flat, so the patient has to be transported in a sitting up position. So in these circumstances, it's very difficult to do a manual chest compression, so we have to apply the Lucas, and we also improvise that there's a strip which can put on hanging on the shoulder of the patient so that the device will not slide into the abdomen, and also during intervention like PCI, and also during transportation down the stairs, which is if you have a mechanical chest compression device, that will make the transfer the interruption of chest compression much less. And the most important thing is the rescuer should be well trained and continuous surveillance program to ensure the use of the adjunct do not have no adverse effect, causes excessive injury or causes excessive pause of chest compression during the application of the device. I think that's my last slide. And a bit of advertisement. We have a national emergency medicine meeting in next year, January 27-28 in Singapore. So I want to welcome everyone to our conference. Thank you for attention.
Thank you, Professor Lam. You can join us. Sit here, please. Questions? Okay, can we have questions if anybody has a question, or we can leave it until the end of the session? Okay, sounds good. Please join us. So the next speaker is Dr. Muawiyah. He is a consultant and chairman of anesthesiology in Jordan Hospital. He will speak about the advances in trauma care, quiet evolution, and hemodynamic changes. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Assalamu alaikum. My talk is going to be today, as Mr. Chairman, Dr. Khalid mentioned, about the advances in trauma. Unfortunately, our part of the world probably we are becoming major victims of trauma, all kinds of trauma, whether road traffic, whether terrorism, all kinds of trauma. And the trauma is the third most common cause of mortality worldwide. And Dr. Kaki yesterday mentioned probably it's becoming the first common cause of mortality in our part of the world rather than third cause. The problem with the trauma as well, it targets the group, it's a younger group, productive group, people who are still working, and the country needs them. And usually at the quite early age, and anywhere between age of 1 year to probably 44 years. And worldwide, over 5 million deaths from trauma per year, excluding our part of the world. While injuries to the CNS are the leading cause of mortality, hemorrhage, major hemorrhage is responsible for about 40% of mortality, with up to 50% of the hemorrhage dying prior to their arrival in hospital, despite the fact that it could be probably preventable and reversible. And this is the major topic of my talk, is going to be prevention or dealing with the hemorrhage. Major hemorrhage, it's the loss of 100% of total blood volume within 24 hours, we call it major hemorrhage. Or if you lose 50% of your total blood within 4 hours, or if it is 150 ml per minute, we consider it as a major hemorrhage and should be dealt with as a major hemorrhage and should be treated. And it accounts, as I said, for more than 80% of mortality in OR and in theaters, 50% of overall mortality in the first 24 hours after admission. So the importance of successful resuscitation of major hemorrhage is becoming paramount to deal with. An estimated 10 to 20% of these deaths potentially preventable with better control of bleeding if we control them. And from here comes damage control resuscitation, which should involve early delivery of blood cells, plasma platelets, ratio 1 to 1 to 1, appear to be probably the best substitution for fresh whole blood at the moment to to minimize the trauma-induced coagulopathy. However, the current literature consists only of survival, I mean like any other evidence-based at the moment. It's all the time survival bias prone and probably observational studies from the conflicts around us. So the standardization of evidence-based clinical care in trauma is vital with the goal to improve trauma outcomes. And the study has documented that low compliance rates with trauma protocols, wherever they are. And protocols should be, it is one in my institution, but usually it has been confirmed that major deviation from guidelines is there. Based clinical are associated with significantly higher mortality because sometimes we just carried away dealing with the patient without following the protocol and we deviate from the protocol. Even so, there is a standard trauma care for the initial hour, but there is no, if you look all the major trauma guidelines, there is no guidelines after 1 hour what to deal with the patient. So there is little standardization subsequently, and we don't know what to do with the patient, and each one start to deal with the patient according to his best knowledge. Then the National Academy of Science, Engineering and Medicine, NASM, proposed a national trauma care system integrating military and civilian trauma system to achieve zero preventable death at injury. And in the last decade, I think we learned a lot from military trauma care because there were a lot of military conflicts around us. And the recommendation carries the culture of continuous learning and improvement, coordinating performance, improvement in research, generated evidence-based in trauma care. It has been, as I said, trauma care, it has been a field of remarkable change over the past decade because there were many lessons to be learned from battlefield which have been transferred to trauma care and have changed the conceptual framework of the management of individual patients. And there has been a revolution in organization trauma services, increased understanding of the teamwork which we lack. Especially I'm talking about my part of the world, we lack this team working together. And management should start from the moment of injury to care in the field, and this is the concept of the military care. Patient journey should be treated as well on the journey, and on triage. And the triage, I think, plays a major role on deciding the fate of the injured person. And arrival in trauma center. Finally, resuscitation and surgical care. In between 2005 and 2013, case fatality rate of U.S. service members injured in Afghanistan decreased by 50%, despite an increase in the severity of injury among U.S. troops during the same period of the time. And that's solely because the knowledge of trauma care and the caring for the trauma soldier has been developed and has been changed over that period. As the war in Afghanistan and Iraq ends, fortunately ends, unfortunately for the trauma care people, knowledge and advances in trauma care developed by the Department of Defense may be lost. So probably we have to look for some conflicts somewhere else to keep learning, and the conflicts are still there, to keep learning from there. And this should have implication for the quality of trauma care. So modern trauma system plays a bypass system whereby seriously injured patients are transported to a major trauma center. And this is what we are trying to do with the triage in our country. We're doing triage, the same thing with they have been mentioned to PCI. We mentioned yesterday, there is no PCI in nearby hospital. Probably you should take the patient immediately to hospital where they can care for them rather than just resuscitate them in a hospital where there is no PCI possibilities. Bypassing significantly reduce the appropriate care, many patients, but requires appropriate triage at the scene of injury. And this is unclassified, declassified. I've just took it from the internet, from the management of the American troops in Iraq when they were in Iraq. They divided Iraq to 3 major trauma cares, and this is 3 major trauma care centers where any soldier with injury should be transported to one of the seriously injured. This is the final destination of which. And then around 11 minor early resuscitation or damage control resuscitation, where to stop the bleeding, care for them, give them what's necessary, fluids, and then finally transfer them to one of 3 major trauma care centers. And I think this is the successful issue with change and reduce mortality and morbidity of trauma by deciding where to go and triage the patient. So seriously injured patients may undergo major surgery to treat their injuries at the field, and this is damage control resuscitation, early definitive surgery to stop the bleeding. However, many trauma patients arrive in hospital with severe metabolic coagulation and physiological derangement, and damage control resuscitation and surgery are directed towards correcting these derangements. So we have to damage control them at the field, at the site of the trauma, whether road traffic accident or as an explosion or terrorism. These circles should not take more than 1 hour. And if they do damage control resuscitation, damage control surgery, and then should be transferred to one of the 3 major centers, and this should anywhere between 1 and 24 hours. And then there is a definitive surgery. They used, as you know, all of you know, they used to take them to Germany, so long flights for definitive surgery. So we should have our own triage system for our own tertiary hospital, probably what to do with them, and that's in collaboration with emergency medical services to avoid bringing patients to unqualified hospitals. Now, a few points about hemodynamic changes in trauma. I'm going to talk about response in hemorrhage when there is a simple hemorrhage, which usually does not in trauma. It is uncommon in trauma, you don't see it, but only this is on the study. Just to show you that the pattern of physiological response is progressive, simple hemorrhage is biphasic. Short period of transfer, hypotensive resuscitation with a blood pressure not exceeding 90 millimeter mercury, usually it's good up to 1 hour. If you think you've got prolonged transportation, after 1 hour we should normalize blood pressure again for a period till you normalize the lactic acid and oxygen, and probably you go in hybrid again. So hybrid resuscitation was found to be superior in hypotensive resuscitation for extended evacuation up to 8 hours. So clinical decisions are often based on compromise, balance of risk, and resuscitation is no exception of this compromise. So the evaluation schedule should be made on case-by-case basis. Effective opioids, I said, alluded to morphine. Probably we have to look at morphine. There are some studies at the moment looking at the fentanyl instead of morphine, because probably fentanyl at the moment they are providing, there are some studies, as I mentioned, ongoing, and fentanyl behaving differently from morphine. Why, we don't know yet. And there is a great area interest in endogenous and exogenous opioids. Sorry, I have to go quickly because it's a long slide and I could see the time. Now, endogenous opioids, there's of a great interest. I mean, if you look at the injured fox here or wherever he goes in the cage, stays for a few days, and then he walks out of his cave in normal condition. Probably if we don't interfere with the physiology of the body as much, and that's why it generates lots of research of endogenous opioids, probably we will do better than worse in the outcome. Now, take-home message, trauma casualty commonly suffers a number of insults concurrently, as I showed you. Usually there is blast wave, there is a gas wave, blast lungs, and there is a shock wave, and burns, all come, and massive musculoskeletal injuries. So we have to deal with so many things. So an understanding of characteristic of hemodynamic response of these can help guide treatment and strategies. Damage control resuscitation now is the focus upon arrival in the hospital. I think we have, in the past when they used to call us, resuscitate the patient when he's stable, we can take it to fatal, it's not valid anymore. We have to damage control, we have to damage resuscitate, we have to damage anesthetize, we have to damage everything so we can save the patient before definitive surgery. Crystalloid delivery should be minimized as it can cause harm. As I said yesterday, we used to give in the past 2 liters and 3 liters, and nowadays it should be minimized to the minimum because we have to benefit from the hypertensive technique. Trauma-induced coagulopathy is a common problem caused by dilution and consumption of clotting factors, hypothermia and acidosis. Evidence suggests that can be decreased by early delivery of blood products. Can one ever be an adequate substitute for fresh whole blood? Probably the evidence so far, probably this is the best evidence available today. Use of factor 7 is controversial in trauma and has probably at the moment no place to show any benefit of factor 7A recombinant factor. If you really want to use tranexamic acid, it's much cheaper. In my country, factor 7A is around $1,500, whereas tranexamic is probably $6 or $7. So probably they'll give you the same results in trauma. Giving unnecessary plasma and platelets should be discouraged in order to reduce the risk of transfusion-related acute lung injury. And probably point of care. We take thrombelastography now is the standard of care, maybe a decision making to reduce unnecessary transfusion, and it will guide us what to give when at any times. And probably massive transfusion protocols are vital for improving communication and delivery of blood products to the patients. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Abahmed. The floor is open for any question. I wish we don't have any more wars and no more car accidents, especially in the region.
Thank you again for the invitation, and while preparing this talk, I thought I will expand the scope of my topic to drugs other than adrenaline, because there's an interesting study about amiodarone, which published, I think, last year. And since I was a HO in the late 80s, and we have get rid of several drugs that I was told to give, and now we're no longer practicing it. And this include atropine, beryllium, calcium, bicarb, or isoterally, blah blah. So, but there's one drug that still we use it in every resuscitation, that is epinephrine or adrenaline, and we know that it is the alpha adrenaline effect of adrenaline that improves the survival because of vasoconstriction, and not the beta effect. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of history of adrenaline. I believe this may be the first. It came on because of an animal experiment in 1906. You know, and at the time there is no closed chest compression, so I think all the chest compression that was done is the open chest compression, and they found that while administering this adrenaline, 1 to 2 cubic meter, which is current dose 1,000, it causes asphyxiated animal heart to start beating and produce cardiac output, recordable cardiac output. And since then, there are no randomized controlled trial to prove that adrenaline improve survival. They do have a study comparing adrenaline versus vasopressin, or high-dose adrenaline versus standard dose adrenaline. However, all the study that was done does not show that this adrenaline has improved survival. And again, it is difficult to do a randomized study, because since this adrenaline is already in our resuscitation protocol, and so we can't take it out. It's difficult to introduce a new treatment module, but again, it's very difficult to take out something that's already there unless we show that there's proof of harm. And in clinical practice, we know after intubation, chest compression, and we give a dose of adrenaline, and somehow there's a return of spontaneous circulation, although this is not scientific evidence. And this is a study done in, I think, Scandinavia, Norway country, on the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest randomized trial, and there are several exclusions, like the ambulance witness cardiac arrest or resuscitation by physician, because they will be given medication, and secondary to asthma and bronchitis, where adrenaline is indicated, and they will do patient with VF, CPR 3 minutes before defibrillation, endotracheal intubation, and then they randomized the two groups to ACLS with IV access and drug, and the other group ACLS without IV access. And they only do IV access established 5 minutes after return of spontaneous circulation and give drugs if indicated. So this is not a study of adrenaline versus non-adrenaline, but it's IV access versus no IV access. And this study shows that there is no a demographic of the two groups are similar, and there is no difference in so there's no difference in discharge alive survivor, although there is increased ROSC during resuscitation and admission to ICU, but the most important outcome, discharge alive, and 1 year after cardiac arrest, there is no difference. So this study seems to show that IV is not working. And then this is the only randomized study on adrenaline in our hospital cardiac arrest, and by the late Ian Jacobs, the former chairman of UCOR, as well as the chairman of Resuscitation Council of Australia, and they recruited patients suffering a cardiac arrest out of hospital after third successful shock or after establishment of IV access in the case of non-shockable cardiac rhythm, and 1 milligram adrenaline versus 10 mils of normal saline. And the study, again, there's quite similar demographic between the two groups, and the study shows that there is significant improvement of ROSE achieved in pre-hospital, and also there's increase in rate of survivor admission to hospital. And there, for the survivor to hospital discharge and CPC 1 or 2 post-discharge, there is a difference, okay, which favors the adrenaline group. However, does not achieve statistically significant. And unfortunately, the trial was terminated prematurely because 2 reasons: lack of funding, and also the paramedics are not willing to recruit the patient because they felt that they must compel to give adrenaline. And so if the study going to recruit twice the patient, it would have achieved statistically significant. And so far there's no further randomized study on adrenaline. And few years, 1 year later, there's this paper published in JAMA on Japan out-of-hospital cardiac registry. You know, Japan, they have a national cardiac registry from the EMS, and they have a lot of patients in that registry. So this is not a randomized study, but they do a propensity match analysis using 4 different methods, which I have no idea what how they match it, because I'm not good at statistics. And basically, the out-of-hospital cardiac treated by the EMS services. And in 2005, I think they introduced IV adrenaline, so the number of patients that was administered IV adrenaline was increased